Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Hidden Hindenburg, the untold story of the tragedy, the Nazi secrets, and the quest to rule the skies. By Michael Mccarthy. Narrated by P.J. Ochlan. Hunting truth is no easy task. We must look everywhere for its tracks. Saint Basil the Great. Air. For our struggle is not with the flesh and blood, but with the principalities, with the powers, with the world rulers of this present darkness, with the evil spirits in the heavens. Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 12. 1. Dealing with demons. The silvery Zeppelin glided over the long coast of Brazil. As palm trees swayed below, the cigar-shaped balloon nosed along the Atlantic Ocean. Saturday evening, the last day of June 1934. The easy tropical winds delighted the captain, a stooped man with a goatee in the middle of life. Hugo Echner loved flying the South American route. It offered a respite from the hardship of the fatherland, the bone cold. He was in his 5th year skippering the Graf Zeppelin, a marvel more than 2 football fields long that weighed 75 tons, but could float across the sky like a feather. The Graf Zeppelin was his magic carpet. He had ridden it around the entire globe, shadowing whole city blocks, crowds cheering in exotic tongues, spirits lifting from the Great Depression. The famed Zeppelin, a high-wire act with flammable hydrogen, landed the daring aviator on front pages across the globe. He wanted more. Back in Germany, he had begun meeting with Joseph Goebbels, a man of ambition in the new government with a lush bank account. Echner wanted to own the skies with a ship of dreams. He wanted a new aircraft bigger than the Graf Zeppelin, one that could ferry 100 people, with a dining room and white-gloved waiters, with beds and staterooms, the largest flying object the world had ever seen. It didn't even have a name yet, but Hindenburg had a nice ring to it. Echner looked down from the bridge, his blue eyes twinkling, his face nicely tanned. Gulls wheeled far below. He watched the sandy shore whiten with waves at the port city of Santos, Brazil. He was riding high. All was calm. Suddenly, the Zeppelin's radio operator appeared on the bridge, a window-enclosed room brightly lit with electric bulbs. He was anxious. He whispered to Echner, "Everything in Germany has turned upside down." From his headphones in the radio room, the young man had just picked up bulletins from British radio. The news came in bursts. Ernst Röhm, a celebrated Nazi official, had been arrested. Kurt von Schleicher, the former chancellor, had been shot. Many more slain. Berlin awaited the return of Hugo Echner. Hours earlier, a black Mercedes made its way through southern Germany. The new chancellor was riding in silence, his hour come round at last. Riding into the day, he became Hitler. Headlights broke the cold morning dark as his car pulled up to the Hotel Hanselbauer. It was in the lakeside town of Bad Wiese, about 30 miles from Munich. Hitler marched up to the 2nd floor, a revolver in his long leather coat. He hammered his fist on the door. His longtime friend and ally, a co-founder of the Nazi Party, was inside. Roused from his bed, Ernst Röhm, a tubby man wearing only pajama bottoms, opened up. Hitler rushed in with several black uniformed officers and looked Röhm in the eyes. Tired, dazed, Röhm stood bewildered, an old scar running from his nose to his chin. Hitler then startled the half-awake leader of the SA, a national guard of sorts in Germany that had arisen since the last war. The SA was composed of stormtroopers known as the notorious Brown Shirts. Hitler spat a barrage of insults, accused Röhm of treason, and shouted that he was under arrest. Throughout the hotel, filled with vacationing brown shirts, Hitler's SS police struck open doors, rousing the troopers from their sleep and herding them into the hallways. The SS men commandeered all the brown shirts into military trucks. It was just before sunup. Sitting shoulder to shoulder, the captives spoke anxiously among themselves. No idea they had been double-crossed. Hitler motioned to his chauffeur, and they were off to a second stop, the stormtroopers' brown house. The Nazi Party had bought the old mansion and converted it into the headquarters for the SA. The street in front had just been cleared by the police. Several dozen SA troopers were sleeping on benches. Some had kicked off their boots, unbuckled their crossbelts. Some snoozed in their unbuttoned brown shirts. They had been out drinking, singing, and carousing in the beer gardens into the night. Some were still awake, hungover, and murmuring in the halls, when they noticed extra guards quietly stationed at the doors. There was no whiff yet of danger. The SA had, up to this point, been a tremendous ally of Adolf Hitler. The paramilitary group, street thugs really, helped bring him to power. Hitler was the brains of Nazi policy. The brown shirts were the brawn to back it up. But the brown shirts had grown to be an enormous alliance, 3 million strong, a formidable army in its own right that could unseat Hitler at any given moment. Hitler decided to short-circuit this threat, using his elite paramilitary group, the SS, known for their black uniforms. In effect, he chose the goons in black shirts to snuff out those in brown. The puny man with a smudge of a mustache had used his hypnotic voice to ride his Nazi Party's popularity into Germany's parliamentary government. By the summer of 1934, the Nationalist Party with the crooked cross flag had achieved remarkable power. It was even, at that moment, somewhat reputable. Germany's beloved president, an old field marshal and hero of the Great War, Paul von Hindenburg, had to admit it. The Nazi Party had made vanquished Germany, in very short order, feel great again. Hindenburg had personally chosen Hitler to be his chancellor only 18 months earlier. Adoring the spotlight, Hitler met with foreign dignitaries, delivered radio speeches, and posed for photographs with chubby babies and boys in lederhosen. On that dewy morning in Munich, there were new orders at the Brown House. Any SA stormtrooper who wanted to come in could enter at any time all throughout the night. But no one was allowed to leave after 5:30 a.m. Some asked why, but were given only a one-word reply: orders. At the top of the 3-story Brown House was an enormous swastika in a circular sign. The stony building was stately, resembling a courthouse, with wrought iron balconies on the second floor. Perched on the window ledges that Saturday morning, weary SA officers looked through the misty light of a tall street lamp out front. Truckloads of police and black uniformed militia had begun to surround the building. No one could leave. By 10 in the morning, Hitler showed up. He knew the Brown House well. For many years, he kept an office at the party headquarters there. Munich, in fact, was the first soil for Nazism. Hitler's limping lieutenant, Goebbels, who had been riding with his boss all morning a witness to the fledgling purge, spoke excitedly about the cover story he would provide the press. Anxious and sleepless, Hitler stared ahead blankly. When they stepped through the tall front door, with a stone triangle above it, Hitler was finally ready to speak. He motioned to Goebbels, his slight, skeletal minister of propaganda. Goebbels was to call the other conspirator in this murderous scheme, Prime Minister Hermann Göring. Goebbels had a code word for the operation to proceed. He asked the operator to put him through to Berlin and breathed 3 syllables into the receiver. Kolibri, the German word for hummingbird. Flabby in his military uniform, Göring had been waiting for the call. With Hitler and Goebbels rounding up top SA leaders in Munich, Göring began unleashing strike forces in northern Germany. In Berlin, in Munich, in Silesia, all over Germany, SS assassins began breaking the eagle and swastika seals on their envelopes and reading their orders, the names of the people they were to execute. The blacks would begin taking out the browns, all German brothers. From his office in Berlin, Göring, with a few sparing words from his moon face, impulsively condemned anyone who had ever crossed him or Hitler. To one triggerman he simply said, "Find Klausener and kill him." The SS assassin clicked his heels, knowing who that was, and was gone. At the Brown House, which would become Hitler's headquarters for the looming massacre, Hitler looked over a list of SA leaders. Most SA members had full-time jobs as plumbers or factory workers, but they moonlighted as mercenary soldiers. The brown shirts had become so large that the actual German army, limited to only 100,000 soldiers by wartime treaty, felt threatened as well. Hitler decided to side with the army. Having the German army as his ally would help him succeed the aging, frail Hindenburg. He needed to purge the SA leadership, so he concocted alarmist stories that Röhm and his SA were planning a revolt, which had to be put down before it started. Sitting at a desk, Hitler looked at the SA list. Angrily, he marked an X in front of one name. Then quickly another, then another. At times he paused at a name, thought about it, then drew a crisscross. The silence was broken only by the pen scratches. One of those checked off was Karl Ernst, the SA leader in Berlin. He would be some trouble to find as he was on his honeymoon. Hitler then handed the list to a lieutenant and said, "Take 6 men and an SS officer with you, and have the SA leaders executed for high treason." The dragnet was now in full swing. Hitler would employ the Gestapo, his secret police, and the SS, his elite military guard. Working in teams of 2 and 3, coordinating by telephone and teleprinter, Gestapo and SS operatives fanned out through Berlin, Dresden, Munich, and elsewhere. Late in the morning, 2 cars pulled up to the Munich villa of Gustav Ritter von Kahr. He had crossed Hitler over a decade ago and hadn't been in politics since. As von Kahr opened the door, 3 men seized him and shoved him into a car. Afraid, the man of 73 with a handlebar mustache said nothing. They were headed 17 miles north, to a new prison at Dachau. Wilhelm Eduard Schmidt pulled the bow across his cello as his wife interrupted to announce 4 men wanted to see him. They nabbed him from his Munich home in front of his anguished wife and 3 children. Schmidt, peering through his round glasses, assured her it would all be straightened out. They drove off with the music man's protests falling on deaf ears. In the morning mayhem, the SS men were supposed to arrest a different man named Schmidt. Around 11:30 a.m., Kurt von Schleicher was in his study outside Berlin. He heard his doorbell ring, then footsteps. The housekeeper had let several men in. The former chancellor, a dapper dresser who preceded Hitler in the high public office, was speaking on the phone. His cane was in the corner. On the other end of the line, his friend heard von Schleicher say to someone, "Yes, I am General von Schleicher." Then a burst of firearms. One of the intruders hung up the phone. Von Schleicher hit the carpet, blood spreading. Hearing the shots, his wife, Elisabeth, dropped her knitting and ran to the study. They had been married only 18 months. Seeing her husband sprawled on the floor, she cupped her face in her hands and screamed. Startled, the men in black shot her. She hit the carpet. Erich Klausener, the man Göring condemned with the sparse phrase, "Find Klausener and kill him," was in his office at the Ministry of Transport. He was a prominent Catholic in Berlin who once helped write a speech critical of the Nazis. 2 SS men stepped in and told him he was under arrest. He barely stepped from his desk when one of the men shot him, and then, under orders, placed the pistol in his hand to stage his death as a suicide. At the Brown House, Hitler manned the phone, and as the names of those executed came in, he crossed them off his list. Further north in Berlin, Göring began having lunch in his office, with beer and sandwiches. Between beer bottles, Gestapo agents occasionally dropped little white strips of paper with the names of those arrested. Delighted as the slips came in, Göring shouted, "Shoot them, shoot them." The daylight executions continued. Bernhard Stempfle, a Catholic priest believed to have known about some of Hitler's sexual indecencies, was dropped in a forest outside Munich, shot 3 times through the heart. His neck was also broken. Von Kahr perished nearby. He met his end mutilated, hacked to death. Röhm was shot in a prison cell. At Dachau, the coffin of Schmidt, the music critic taken by mistake and tortured to death, was nailed shut for return to his wife. That afternoon, SS men caught up with Karl Ernst, the chief of the Berlin Brownshirts. He was on the west coast of Germany and headed on his honeymoon to the resort island of Madeira. Ernst, bug-eyed like the screen star Peter Lorre, could not believe he was under arrest. Hitler himself had stood as a witness at his wedding. Orders, he was told. The SS flew him to Berlin, where he was driven 20 miles southeast and held for hours in a dank cellar at the Lichterfelder Barracks, an old Prussian cadet training building that the Nazis had taken over. There were 100 other SA officers packed in the cellar with him, sweaty, anxious, cursing or praying, as the blood drained from their faces. Evening turned ghastly. Ernst and the names of 3 other men were called out, and the 4 were led from the cellar to a large courtyard. They were marched to a red brick wall. 8 sharpshooters stood at the ready. Backs to the wall, they faced the firing squad. Other groups of 4 had been called previously, and the men in the cellar heard the shots. But now, as his group appeared, Ernst's bulging eyes saw blood covering the wall. Still taking that in, their shirts were torn open. The only words spoken, "By order of the Führer, aim, fire." Stiff-jawed or cowering, the men added their splattered blood and hunks of flesh to the wall, which the SS men did not clean between executions. The scene became so gory that the teams of 8 SS riflemen, sickened, had to be replaced repeatedly. Later, the SS men loaded the piles of bodies onto a horse-drawn meat carriage and drove them off to be burned. It would be a week before the Kraftzeppelin would return on July 6, 1934, to a very different Germany. During the 81-hour and 12-minute crossing, the Zeppelin's radio man reported regularly to Captain Eckner on the latest with the countrywide executions. Word of the bloody treachery, which transpired the previous weekend, spread throughout Germany, between neighbors, in offices, at outdoor markets. Reporters, however, were silent. In the year since he was installed as Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels had established complete control over newspapers and radio. Crossing him could mean being locked up at Dachau. But he could not control the foreign reporters. The world had come to know Hitler and his Nazi Party in the past 18 months for arrogant bullying, for menacing the Jewish population. The latest dispatches from Germany horrified the world. Details were sparse. That 100 or more were killed wouldn't come out for years. But the callousness of the few known executions, men dragged off into the night without judges or courts, seemed more like the crimes of medieval marauders than the actions of a legitimate government in a great modern nation. From the interior of the American continent, a newspaper in the Mississippi River town of St. Louis sounded off, "Hitler has begun to kill. He has sent his bullets against men who, former friends or not, arouse his fanatic moral conscience. Nazis now have begun to kill each other. And today, Germany asks, where, when, and with whom will the killing stop?" The truth is, Hitler had made a deal with the army to annihilate the leadership of the rival paramilitary group, the SA. And Goebbels and Hitler had fabricated a story that Röhm and some of his SA leaders were on the verge of a military coup, tossing in charges of homosexual debauchery in an attempt to repulse the nation and justify their being stamped out. Goering ordered all records of the operation destroyed. After 2 weeks, Hitler himself finally had to make a public address. President Hindenburg, who was ill with cancer, was consigned to his estate in Neudeck, Germany. And more, Hitler was becoming the face of official Germany. Clutching the lectern at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, Hitler unleashed his bombast, spit flying in his rapid-fire delivery. "Mutinies are judged by their own laws. If someone asked me why we did not use the regular courts, I would reply, at that moment I was responsible for the German nation. Consequently, it was I alone who during those 24 hours was the Supreme Court of Justice of the German people." Hitler spoke before members of the parliament called the Reichstag, who were nervously applauding, seated under sparkling chandeliers, with black-uniformed SS men stationed all around. Hitler then sought to strengthen his connection to the nation's beloved Paul Ludwig Hans Anton von Beneckendorf und von Hindenburg, who at 6'5" had been a mythic figure in Germany since the Great War. Hindenburg so soundly defeated the larger Russian army at the Battle of Tannenberg on the Eastern Front in 1914 that the Russian commander committed suicide on the spot. Into his 80s, Hindenburg, a man of Victorian times with a deep voice and a handlebar mustache, still wore a chest full of medals and an anachronistic pointed helmet with gold tip. From the podium, Hitler reminded them that the great Hindenburg himself had chosen him. "Since the Marshal's confidence has placed me where I am aware only of a great concern for the present life of our people and its future." Within 2 weeks, Hindenburg, elected twice by the German people as their president, died at age 86. Hitler moved swiftly to vacate the president's office, saying no one could fill boots as grand as Hindenburg's, and he consolidated the power of both men into himself, into a dictator, a position he called the Führer. Neighboring countries grew nervous. Border patrols were stepped up, and diplomats gathered to plot responses. Editorialists throughout Europe sounded alarms. The Times of London warned of the new regime's savagery, disregard for all the forms of law, political methods of the Middle Ages. In short, Goebbels had a public relations disaster on his hands. Though his savagery would worsen, Hitler would always desperately crave respect, legitimacy. So, Goebbels decided to mastermind a campaign to show the world that all of Germany was behind Hitler, this man of high morals who stamped out debauchery, saving the German people from chaos and scandal, this misunderstood leader. German citizens would be asked to approve the fusing of Hindenburg's power into the person of Hitler, into the Führer. A referendum was scheduled for late August. The world press that summer couldn't shake what history would come to call the Night of the Long Knives. Thomas Mann, a German novelist and Nobel laureate who left Germany the previous February, looked back on his homeland with shame. He called Hitler a dirty swindler and murderous charlatan, a gangster of the lowest sort. Goebbels needed to deflect the criticism. "Everywhere we're falling into discredit," he lamented in his diary. Hitler was slumping. The vote legitimizing the Führer needed to be strong. Goebbels needed to whip up zealous support. He needed to have other prominent Germans, luminaries whom the public respected, endorse Hitler. Goebbels immediately thought of Dr. Hugo Echner. The two had met briefly after Goebbels accompanied Hitler to power. Just the summer before, Echner was in his propaganda ministry office in Berlin. Goebbels didn't care much for him, but the famous Zeppelin commander could be an important cheerleader for the Nazi cause. Goebbels himself had ridden on the world-renowned Kraftzeppelin a year earlier in grand style to Rome, to introduce himself and the new ruling party to the fascists in Italy. As the summer of 1934 deepened, Goebbels knew that Dr. Echner's voice was as well known throughout Germany as Hitler's. After building the Kraftzeppelin, the largest flying machine in its day, Echner piloted it around the world in 1929, making headlines from Europe and the United States to Asia and Russia. Airplanes, still in their infancy as flimsy stick and cloth contraptions, couldn't touch the voyage. Echner was as world-famous then as Charles Lindbergh, who crossed the Atlantic alone in his Spirit of St. Louis plane in 1927. The sheer audacity of Echner's globe-trotting flight startled the world, and stoked embers of respect for Germany. New York City had celebrated Echner with 2 ticker-tape parades. Time magazine put pouchy-eyed Echner on its cover, and the National Geographic Society awarded him a special gold medal. Even U.S. presidents were starstruck by the commander of the renowned Kraftzeppelin. Invited to the White House, Echner had met with Calvin Coolidge and later Herbert Hoover. And everywhere Echner landed, flashbulbs popped and a flock of reporters circled. His broken English made him sound exotic to radio listeners in the United States. His celebrity was nearly unparalleled around the world. Yes, this was the man Goebbels needed. When the two met at the propaganda ministry the year before, 1933, Echner was in financial trouble. Construction was being delayed on his new ship, designed to be 1/3 larger than the Kraftzeppelin, one so big it would challenge the old laws of physics and the newer theories of aeronautics. Echner's Zeppelin factory was running low on money. Meeting with Goebbels, Hitler's trusted lieutenant, Echner explained that he needed 2 million Reichsmarks to continue building his dream ship. Goebbels thought something could be worked out. Echner would need to consider himself indebted to Hitler, to the new regime. The grand new Zeppelin could be dispatched for party propaganda, for flyovers of parades, marches, and rallies. With the fat check from the Nazi government, construction was stepped up at the famed factory in Friedrichshafen, a little shoreline town on Lake Constance, or the Bodensee in German, far south in Germany. It was called the Luftschiffbau Zeppelin, or the Zeppelin airship maker. The plant, which had constructed more than 100 crayon-shaped Zeppelins over 30 years, had hired hundreds of new workers. Giant round girders were in place, and tons of a special light type of aluminum were on order. The big new ship was finally going to happen. With Hitler in trouble by the summer of 1934, Goebbels wanted to collect on the donation the Nazis made to the Zeppelin Company. Echner needed to deliver a 3-minute speech that would be broadcast across Germany in his familiar voice, oddly high-pitched for a man with a thick torso. He needed to endorse Hitler in the upcoming nationwide vote. To complete his futuristic Hindenburg, Echner would have to deal with demons. This was surely a predicament. With all his celebrity, Echner himself had briefly considered running for president of Germany against Hitler in 1932. Newspaper articles wondered if Echner would step in as a candidate. Friends had suggested he do so, but he really wasn't political. He mostly enjoyed the cheering crowds, the adoring politicians and reporters, the cameras, the microphones. Worse, Hitler was frightening.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?